Hello, it's Ruby, and today I have got 12 book recommendations for the summer. Summer is of course the time where we have more time to read than we do any other time of the year, which is also quite infuriating in many ways because reading in autumn, reading in winter, reading when it's cold outside is the most enjoyable time to read, I think. I'm definitely something of a seasonal reader, so I like to read books which suit with the season, and these are some of my favourite summer books. Books which encapsulate the essence of summer very well. And so yes, these are books to read over the summer, but also if you were looking forward to the summer, for example in the spring, these might be books you want to pick up. All of them are wonderful and I will be giving reviews of each. I've also got myself some tea because when talking about books, when doing book reviews, I always like to get some tea. Today I'm having Butter Brew by Bird and Blend. This is one of their newer blends and it's inspired by butterbeer, and I had it for the first time the day before yesterday and oh my gosh, it's divine. It's so good. It's a black tea base and then, oh, I almost forgot to use the tea strainer. It's a black tea base and then it's kind of got caramel notes to it, and I like to brew it just with some oat milk and also some sugar. And I've also got myself some biscuits. We're going to start with Winesburg, Ohio by Sherwood Anderson. Anderson, I think, is the king of provincial slow storytelling, and he captures the languid slowness of summer so well in this book. I also did read some of his short stories in late May. He's a short storyist first and foremost, but I preferred this to the short story collection because even though this is still essentially a collection of short stories, all of them are set in the same town of Winesburg, Ohio. So all of the stories are interconnected and you see the same characters popping up. My camera ran out of charge, so I'm sorry about that. I was just talking to you about Winesburg, Ohio. I've also finished all of my biscuits in the time being because I just got on with some work while my camera was charging. So as I was saying, you can see how everyone in this village, everyone in this small town is connected and their stories overlap and they influence each other just in the same way that that actually does happen in real life. And I think Anderson does a really great job on showing how we do all rely on each other and how we are interconnected, especially when we're all within a small space like a very intimate village. So we've got this map at the start and you can just see how provincial it is from the size of it. And we've got one character, a young man. It's been a while since I read this, but I'm sure that there's one character, a young man who is kind of thinking of leaving the town. And I'm going to read you the first page. At his desk, the writer worked for an hour. In the end, he wrote a book which he called The Book of the Grotesque. It was never published, but I saw it once and it made an indelible impression on my mind. The book had one central thought that is very strange and has always remained with me. One thing I will say about this though, which I've got mixed feelings about, Anderson does have a distinctly male voice, and this can actually be quite infuriating much of the time. I didn't really acknowledge that when I read it for the first time when I read this book when I was like 15, 16. But when I read his short stories, it became so clear how like male-centric his narrative is. Like he only really writes about men. He doesn't tend to write about women. That's not to say that it's not exquisite writing. I think he captures the provinciality of this village and like summer very well, but it is a very male voice. He does show real people very well, but mainly men, not so much women. So that's book number one. The second book, which I do have a copy of, but I can't now find, is We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. Of course, this book has become so popular on TikTok. I'm sure you've heard about it, if not read it. But if you haven't read it, this is your call to do so, especially over the summer. It's the perfect book to read over the summer, as is the sequel, which just came out too, which was Family of Liars. Follows the parents of the characters in this book instead. I spoke about it in my top 5 books of this year so far. This book is all about the Sinclair family, an extremely privileged old money family in America who owns a private island off from Martha's Vineyard. They go there every summer. They spend the whole summer, their family, together on this private island away from the rest of the world, away from everything else, and it's a world of casual luxury. There are 3 families, the grandparents and their 3 daughters, and then their families, and the older children, the teenagers, the cousins are all extremely close and spend the whole summer together. So of course the book is set in summer, and it is a great book to read in summer, but it's a wonderful exploration of privilege, wealth, and the corrupt and unethical practices which underscore this wealth, and kind of what is ignored in the pursuit of this, and kind of what things are happening under the surface. E. Lockhart is bringing such important conversations to the forefront, and her other books do explore these same themes as well, which I really like. So you should definitely read some of her other books if you like this one. But yeah, it also does just have a really pleasant summer feel to it. It seems very laid back, it's very casual, you know, it's them sitting out on the boardwalk eating crisps, or running down to the sea in their pyjamas. It's got a very nice feel to it. Some people don't like Lockhart's writing style. I've heard it said before that she's a bit pretentious because she tends to write in very short sentences, often incomplete grammar in those sentences, and then has lots of line breaks. So when you're looking at the book, when you're looking at it on the page, it very much looks like poetry. But I personally find that it works perfectly for what Lockhart is trying to achieve, and I think it's really pleasant to read. Also, it's good to experiment with narrative style. Not all books should be the same, and it's cool to see a book which is doing something different with the way that it's written. And there is so much intentionality behind it, because a lot of it looks like poetry, but not all of it. There are whole sections which are in prose, you know, look very standard, and then in the most dramatic spaces, we see Katie, our protagonist, moving more into a like poetic style, which is more fragmented. And I think that works so well to show how Katie is struggling, how she's slightly unstable, and to just kind of get a greater sense of her internal monologue and kind of like what's happening in her mind, as opposed to it just being plot. Lockhart is using the actual writing to help us understand Katie better. And if we think about it, poetry is essentially where you cut out what you don't need. So if you have like a long piece of prose, to make it into poetry, you need to cut out the things which aren't necessary. You substitute words, you condense the writing so that you can capture a single moment, so you can capture a feeling. And we see Katie doing something very similar in her own life. She becomes very minimalistic, and she's getting rid of everything. She's donating everything. She doesn't want to have any stuff. So in the same way that she's kind of getting rid of material possessions, we also see her getting rid of words, you know, condensing that down. So I think it works so well with the character, and I really like it. Also, it does really help with the pacing of the book, because not much actually really happens in terms of plot. It is quite slow paced in terms of plot, but the writing style means that it still feels very high paced, and it still is like the book moves very quickly. The writing style kind of gives the impression that more is happening. I read it twice, and both times I read it in a day, pretty much in one sitting. So yeah, I'd really recommend We Were Liars. Next is The Great Garden by Meg Rossoff. I loved this. I read this 2 years ago, and I just wish I were rereading it again for the first time this summer. I'm very tempted to reread it. It's very short, like, if you see, there's a lot of spacing. It basically looks like it's triple spaced, I swear. This is kind of a slightly older We Were Liars. It really reminded me of We Were Liars when I read it. Again, it's about a large, privileged family who are all staying together over the summer. However, instead of being set in America, this is set in England. I believe it's set in... where is it? I don't actually know where in England it's set, but it's set somewhere with sand dunes and close to the sea. And they're staying in this old, rambly, large house where they go every year. So the family is planning a wedding, and that's kind of the story's backbone. That's what like kind of ties everything together. In terms of plot, it's not kind of like action driven, as you can imagine then, because the wedding isn't until the end of the summer. But that's not to say that, again, it's not fast paced. It's very easy to read. It's very readable. Half a summer romance between our protagonist and a boy called Kit. Every year when school ends, we jam the car full of indispensable junk and head to the beach. By the time 6 people have crammed their bare essentials into one car, Dad says he can't see out the windows and there's no room for any of us, so half of everything is removed, but it doesn't seem to help. I always end up sitting on a tennis racket or a bag of shoes. By the time we set off, everyone's in a foul mood. And I think this book just captures summer, and English summer especially, really, really well. It reminds me of the long summers that my family would spend in Devon. My sister, mum and I would go down to Devon for like the whole of the summer, like 2 whole months, and then my dad would come down in between work. This book really reminds me of that kind of very slow pace of living, that kind of languid summerness. That's the only way to describe it. And the characters in the same way as We Were Liars. It's truly delightful and nostalgic to read, and I really like the writing style too. It's quite poetic. Again, give this one a go if you haven't already. Also, beautiful cover. Like, you just kind of want to buy this book just so you can have the cover on your shelf. Next is Call Me By Your Name. I feel like everyone's talking about this book this summer in particular. Film is of course beautifully done, but the book is just exquisite. It's set in the north of Italy in the house of Elio and his parents. Every summer, the family welcomes a PhD student who is working on some research, and Elio's father kind of helps him with that and provides a space for the summer where he can work on it. And this year, Oliver has come to stay. So he gets Elio's bedroom, and Elio falls in love with Oliver. It's all very under the surface and implied as opposed to anything particularly happening. And again, it's kind of capturing that slowness of summer. I know this is very repetitive. I think you can get the sense this is the kind of book that I enjoy reading over the summer because summer is slow. There's this wonderful quote from Fitzgerald actually. He says, "Summer is only the unfulfilled promise of spring, a charlatan in place of the warm balmy nights I dream of in April. It's a sad season of life without growth. It has no day." So I must say the thing that sold me on this book and the thing which kind of made me fall in love with this book is definitely the writing style as opposed to the actual story. Personally, I'm not usually a big fan of romance books. I'd say like romance is my least favourite part of any book, which is quite infuriating actually because most books are swarming with romance, like especially YA fiction. But kind of aside from the actual story and like the romance of it, the writing is so honest and vulnerable, and it plays with point of view in really interesting ways as well, like kind of using the character of I and me. Atonement doesn't use speech marks, for example, which is just so cool, and everything just blurs together into thought. So you don't really know what's real and what's imagined, which is a really cool tension to see, and not something that I've really read that much of. Some bits are very graphic and they were a bit too graphic for me. I didn't really like reading some of the passages, and it's definitely something to be wary of before going into reading this book, but you can like skim through these bits if you want to. Find Me, which is the sequel, is very similar in writing style, but it's not quite so graphic, and contrary to popular opinion, lots of people slate this book and say that Find Me is really bad and it's a letdown to Call Me By Your Name, but I actually loved Find Me. Probably put them on equal par. It still has that honesty and kind of the same writing style, but it's not so graphic. And Find Me is about Elio's father first and foremost, but we also see Elio and Oliver as well. Okay, next. I'm really running out of tea as well. I drank most of it when my camera was charging. Hopefully it's not cold. So the next book is Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man by Siegfried Sassoon, who was a World War I poet, possibly the most famous World War I poet at the time, maybe not retrospectively. Owen probably takes that title, but at the time Sassoon was very well respected. He was upper class, well known beforehand, and he had published a book before, and he published things and he published poetry before going to the front line to fight. These are his memoirs from before he went to the front, and then also when he joins and he starts fighting. That disparity between kind of like the before Sassoon, how war affects him basically. Sassoon is perhaps most famous for his willful, defiant letter to the Times in 1917, which actually got him sent to an asylum. The government needed to discredit him. They couldn't have this contrary opinion being resurfaced by such a well-known figure. In his letter he wrote, "I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority, because I believe the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it." Sassoon's work gained much more depth and reflectivity after the war, I would say, but still I really like this book. And I enjoy these memoirs because they capture a bygone era from before the war, and a kind of cultural naivety, I suppose, as well. The first half of this book is all about his sporting pursuits as a young man, including fox hunting, which honestly is not very pleasant, as well as like many other sports like cricket. I really love the nature descriptions of this, and also there's this wonderful passage, probably my favourite piece of food writing in any book, where they have just got back from a cricket match, I believe, and they have tea. This kind of large group of friends, and it's just wonderful. Next, I'm going to recommend one of my favourite books of all time, which is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Again, this is a book that I suspect a lot of people have read, but if you've somehow not read it yet, this is your sign to go and read it. This is basically an exploration and an expose of racism in 1930s Alabama, where the justice system was very much skewed in favour of white people, African American people. This is something Harper Lee was actually herself very familiar with because her father worked to represent African American people in court. So in the book, Atticus Finch defends a black man, Tom, in court. So I suppose it's kind of part legal drama because we're in and out of the courtroom learning what happens to Tom, but it's also about how this reverberates into real life and how it affects everyone in the village village, everyone in the town, and how it's not something just limited to the courtroom. It's not something separate. It's kind of, this is something pervasive, which is everywhere. So the book is specifically, though, told from the perspective of Scout, who is, I think she's 5 at the beginning of the book, 5 or 6, and then it stretches over the course of a few years. So it's a coming of age novel, and it's kind of Scout learning this lesson of seeing other people as real people and understanding, as Atticus teaches her, that everyone's kind of going through their own thing. Everyone's a real person. Everyone's got their own struggles and their own dreams and their own fears. And just by looking at them, we can't see that. You have to get into somebody's shoes and walk around for a while in order to make any kind of judgment, which is what Atticus tells her. And we see Scout being taught this lesson again and again and again in different spheres of her life with different people, just kind of coming up in every single character. It's a wonderful book, and I recommended it as a summer read because it again does have the kind of feel of summer to it. These books aren't necessarily books about summer, but they're books in which summer is a background, kind of it's in the periphery. Next is The Green Gage Summer by Rumer Godden. This is about an English family who go on holiday for the summer. They go to France. They're a large family, many siblings, but the mother falls ill when they get to France, and so they're taken in by this hotel, and they basically have to fend for themselves over the summer. So the siblings have always kind of come together as a pack. They've always been very close. They've always been like the children together. But over this summer, the eldest falls in love, kind of starts to grow up, and we see these divisions forming between her and the rest of her siblings. And we kind of see this maturity, this coming of age through the green gages. It's one image, like the ripening fruit. Again, there are beautiful nature descriptions in this. I love nature writing. It's probably my favourite kind of writing to read, and it's got a similar feeling to Atonement, if you've ever read that. So actually that leads me on to the next book, which is Atonement by Ian McEwan. I'd say only the first half of this is really a good summer read because the second half is set in the First World War, and I think it's a necessary juxtaposition with the first half. But yeah, there is definitely a change of tone. So the first half is set in Edwardian England. It's set at a large country estate, and it's narrated by 13-year-old Bryony. She's discovered that her sister Cecilia is romantically involved with Robbie. They've grown up with, he's like a brother, but he's of a different social class, and McEwan is exploring kind of social status divisions and the impact of this. I really love Bryony as a character in this, not because I like her. She's not a particularly likeable character, but she's very interesting. She's 13, so she's at the age where she's starting to become more mature, where she's starting to think about things in new ways, but when you expect her to kind of be understanding the world a little more, but she's still so naive in this book, and that naivety is annoying, but I think McEwan captures really well this strange in-between period from child to adult or older teenager. And actually that division between child and adult and like the in-between state is something Ian McEwan seems to explore in quite a lot of his books, like On Chesil Beach and The Children Act as well, so it's possibly something he's very fascinated in, and definitely something which I find really interesting. Nutshell too kind of explores that. The next book, oh my gosh, do I have a copy? I have a copy of this. Where is my copy? There are so many books I'm talking about here. I own all of these books, but I just don't know where they are. Yes, here. The Go-Between. So L.P. Hartley wrote this book after the First World War, and yet it's set at the turn of the century in 1900, when the world was a very different place. Indeed, the first line of this book rings very true, which is, of course, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. And the difference which Hartley would have observed between like post-war England and pre-war England is, of course, huge. This is about Leo has gone to stay with a wealthy school friend for the holidays, and he doesn't really fit in. The house is huge, they've got lots of social rules which he doesn't really understand, and he's just trying to fit into this world basically. And then his friend falls ill, so instead of spending the summer like gallivanting around together on the fields and playing cricket, etc., his friend is locked away in this room, and Leo has to fend for himself for the summer, and he's got the whole of the house basically at his disposal. So to pass the time, he's asked to, and he starts delivering letters between his friend's older sister at the house and a farm labourer in town, and he becomes a go-between between them. So we as a reader know that there is a relationship between them, But Leo doesn't know. He's so naive. I think he's like 10 or 11. He's really young, and this book is kind of, again, like a coming of age story, but much more disturbing and jarring and kind of damaging for Leo, I suppose. Really great book though, and one I would wholeheartedly recommend. Probably my favourite like 1930s book. Next, we've got The Trouble with Goats and Sheep, which is set in the summer of 1976. That sweltering summer which my parents are always talking about whenever it's a hot day. They're like, oh, but the summer in 1976 was much hotter. Anyone who was alive then apparently remembers it, but it was sweltering hot for ages, and there wasn't rainfall, and it was really oppressive, and this book takes that as the background. And it's set in this very Christian, kind of small, very intimate town, and follows these two friends. I think they're like 10 years old. They spend all of their time together, and they're investigating the disappearance of an old woman called Mrs. Creasy, who's just suddenly gone missing and nobody knows where she's gone. The whole village is curious, but these two girls make it their mission to like try and find out what happened to her. And we see them interrogating the different members of the village, the different people in the community, and we kind of get this impression, and we start to realise that so much has been oppressed in this town and so much is unspoken. The thing I really love about this book is the Christian imagery. As I say, it's set in a very like pious village, everyone where the church is very central. I think that really adds to the layers of like not knowing what's going on and things kind of having a patina on top to protect them. It's a really, really good book, and again, one I wish I could just reread for the first time, because I know what happens now, which is quite sad. Alright, we're nearly at the end now. I want to recommend this gem of a book, Me and Emma by Elizabeth Flock. Nobody talks about this. I don't understand why this book has not received so much hype, because it's incredible. I read it years ago. Actually, I say this, I haven't read this for ages, but I'm planning on reading it this year again, rereading it again. I read this when I was like 12 or 13, and it instantly became the best book I'd read. I would tell everyone this is my favourite book of all time. It's so clever. Like, so clever. This is set in South Carolina. Wait, is it South Carolina or North Carolina? I think it's South Carolina. And it's about two sisters. Carrie's 8, she's the narrator, and Emma's 6. And they are very, very different. So Carrie is much more timid, she's shy, she doesn't think of herself as very brave, whereas her sister is bold and likeable, friendly, and but they're very, very close. They live with their mother, who is quite neglectful, and their abusive stepfather in a very deprived household. It's really hard because, again, like when it comes down to it, it seems quite slow paced, but also it is very fast. Like the pace is very fast, and it's very hard to put down because of like because of the family dynamics at play. I'd say it's half provincial and half thriller, which is a really like. It doesn't feel like those two genres can like go hand in hand, but they definitely do in this book. All I can say is you have to read this. Like, just trust me. It's a really quick read. It won't take you very long, but you won't regret getting it. I feel like it's all over eBay. Like you can get copies on eBay really, really cheap. So you should read this. If you liked We Were Liars, I think you'd really like this. And then the final book is Maggot Moon, and I remember sitting outside on the trampoline and reading this whole book in one sitting. It's so fast paced, such a cool premise. It's set in a kind of dystopian society in 1950, so during the Cold War, when there was the race to the moon, like who was going to put a flag on the moon first, America or Russia. It's kind of like 1950s Britain, but under the power of a kind of dictatorship. It's about a boy called Standish, and his family and friends are disappearing left, right and centre, and then he discovers this secret about the moon. It's really good. It's very fast paced. It's a good summer read, and there are loads of twists and turns. Okay, then finally, I wasn't going to recommend this, but when I went to go and get the other books, I saw this on my bookshelf, and I don't know why I didn't include it before. So The Distance Home by Paula Saunders was one of the best books I read in 2020. It's about two siblings, Rennie and Leon, and they're very, very different. So excuse the fact that I'm using gender stereotypes here, but Leon's the brother, but he's conventionally very feminine, whereas Rennie is conventionally masculine, and so as brother and sister, they've kind of like swapped what's kind of expected of them. And this book is exploring how that impacts the family dynamic, how that really impacts their relationship with their father and their mother, especially the father, and kind of what they expect from them versus what they're like. Again, set in the Deep South in South Dakota. Both of them are also very into dancing, like they're both very talented dancers, and it's kind of exploring like how the girl is allowed to do this, whereas the brother, it's seen as in a very different way when the brother wants to. This is a really good book, and Again, you should read it. All of these books are exquisite. I really hope you consider reading some or all of them. If I could reread them again for the first time, I would, and I'm jealous of anyone who gets to read these for the first time. I'm actually going to go outside and read now. I'm reading, let me show you, this book, The Life of Elves by Muriel Barbary, who's a French writer. It's been translated by Alison Anderson, and it's not actually about elves, which I'm quite glad about. It sounds like this would be a very Tolkien kind of book, but it's not. It's got elements of fantasy, but it's more like magical realism than anything, and the writing is opulent. The nature descriptions are exquisite. It's got a very nice autumnal feeling. I'll let you know what I think of this when I finished it, because I'm only like halfway through, but so far I like it, and the cover's nice too. So I'm going to go outside and continue reading this, and I just want to say thank you again for watching, and I hope that you have a productive week. Also, just a quick reminder that the academic planner for 2022 to 2023 has now launched. It's got a woodland design, and it's available on my website, Pumpkin Productivity.